Welcome, everyone, to our first and only fall department seminar. We're very lucky to have Chris Stiffler, who is a former graduate from our MA program and the Senior Economist at the Colorado Fiscal Institute, and also successfully completed the Colorado Trail, all kinds of things you can ask him about. Yeah, and thank you everyone who's joining us online. We've got a not quite full, but pretty full room, which is fantastic. So what my colleague, Dr. Robert Rickard, was just bringing up, Tracy Mott was a former colleague of ours who retired from the department in 2018 and unfortunately died a year ago from COVID. And also relevant to this talk because he was very influential in macroeconomics and fiscal issues, and I believe your thesis supervisor. So it all comes full circle. Definitely appropriate to remember Tracy Mott today. But with that said, I would like to make sure we have enough time for Chris's talk and turn it over to him on fiscal issues on the ballot this fall.
Cool. Thanks. I want to start with a story from 10 years ago. Back in 2012, the education community, which had a thing on the bottom of Colorado's ballot that was going to raise the income tax to generate about $1 billion for schools. And it was going to do that by taking our flat 4.63% rate to a two-tiered, two-step graduated rate at 5% and 5.9%. Like most other states have graduated income tax. It was a way of generating about $1 billion. Get us back up to the national average in per pupil funding, get us back up to the average in school funding. Because of TABOR in the state, we had to ask permission of voters to raise taxes. So it was on the bottom of the ballot. You know, it's a campaign season. People came to me and said, we need the average taxpayer. What is the average taxpayer going to pay under Amendment 66? And so they needed the number for the spot during the Broncos game for the commercial. So I went to census data and pulled median household income 2012. Median household income was $58,000. But if you understand how taxes work, when you do your taxes, you start with adjusted gross income, and then you do your exemptions and deductions and your charitable donations and your mortgage interest, and you whittle down your AGI into taxable income. And then taxable income is upon which the rates are applied. So our flat 4.63% rate is applied to taxable income. So I had to take the median household income, then go to Department of Revenue data and look at the average deductions, exemptions for a household who makes $58,000. And so on average, a household making $58,000 back then had on average about 20 some in deductions and exemptions. And back then you got exemptions for children. There's more exemptions back then before 10 years ago. So you whittle down 58,000 of median household income, about 37,000. And if you do the math, they pay 4.63, they pay at 5%. I told the campaign that it's about an extra $137 you should run with your commercials. And that's the number I saw in the Broncos game, and the little source during Broncos game commercial, was my number. And then one of the local news stations ran a problem solver segment that said, the campaign's lying to you. It's actually not $137, it's actually more. What they did is they downloaded the same census median household income data, $58,000, and then they did their calculations. 4.3% times 5%, and they said it's more like $200, and it was like $215, $230 the average taxpayer would pay if Amendment 66 passes. And they ran a whole segment on the news that said the campaign, Amendment 66 pro campaign's lying to you. Who was right was I was right, and I had to call this reporter and explain the difference between aggregate or adjusted gross income and taxable income. It was all this stuff in the middle that you whittle down your AGI and taxable income. That's how income taxes work. And so I love this story because one of the things on the bottom about this year affects this stuff in the middle I call, but also it sets up the story that we're a citizens initiative state. We're the ones that vote on this stuff. Unlike other states where their elected officials have more say in doing policy, we in Colorado vote on this stuff on the bottom of our ballot. People don't even understand all this stuff, but they're the ones that decide on this stuff. So I like to use that example to show you we need to be educated voters in Colorado because we have so much more say. Since 1880, Colorado has had about 500 different ballot measures on the bottom of the ballot. We shape policy from property taxes to marijuana taxes to housing, affordable housing, to how we fund our schools. We as voters in Colorado get to decide on that stuff on the bottom of the ballot. And so we have 11 different measures on this year's November ballot. You'll see propositions, you'll see double letters, you'll see numbers, and you'll see amendments. The shortcut version of what you need to know, if it's proposition, it changes the law. That can be changed in the future by legislature really easily. If it's amendment, it changes our state constitution. Requires 55% of the votes. A lot harder to change in the future. Changes our state constitution. So amendment changes the constitution. Proposition just changes the law. If it's a number, it went through the citizens initiative process. So basically, someone at the outside Safeway got your signature of 170,000 people and got through the ballot to the citizens initiative process, the signature gathering process. That a number, it came through that system. If it has a letter, it came from the legislature. So basically, our elected officials at the Capitol downtown referred a bill to us to consider on the bottom of the ballot. Okay, it's a little shortcut for y'all. Okay, a little bit more background. What I want to do is set the state budget, explain TABOR, kind of situate why we got $750 checks if you were a taxpayer in the state last year, how those TABOR rebates are impacted by what's going on in the economy right now, and also how these things could also change TABOR situation, change the budget situation, change how we fund, say, schools, homeless programs, and also change how much we will get back in TABOR rebates. Okay, so that's kind of the setup, fiscal, kind of behind the curtain, the fiscal policy of all this complicated stuff we vote on the bottom of the ballot. So first, you got to understand the state budget. It's like $35 billion. There's a big chunk of money we get from the federal funds. We have no control over those dollars. You know, we get money from Congress for our Medicaid, for our roads, for our colleges. The second chunk of the state budget is called cash funds. If you ever hear cash funds in public policy, you should think fees. Like fees for Division of Wildlife, hunting fees are a cash fund. There's a direct connection between hunting fees and what Division of Wildlife pays for. Another good example of a good fee is car registration fees. If you have a driver's license in Colorado, you register your car in Colorado, you pay those pretty high fees. They pay for roads and bridges. There's kind of a direct connection between where a fee is generated and pays for a certain department. Okay. Then there's the general fund, and that's really where we focus most of our attention. It's kind of more of what where all our taxes go. So if you look at the general fund, it's 2/3 income taxes and sales taxes. So think of the general fund as just a collective pot of money where all Coloradans throw their taxes. And then from their taxes, this is where our legislature slices and dices our taxes into what it pays for general purposes. Or think about this way, this is last year's general fund. For every dollar you gave Colorado in income tax or sales tax, 35 cents went to schools. It's the biggest chunk of our general fund. Next biggest chunk is the healthcare chunk. This is mostly Medicaid, healthcare for low-income, disabled populations, elderly populations. Not Medicare. Medicare is federal. This is Medicaid. It's the second biggest chunk of our state budget. And then you have 3 departments that are pretty much the same size each year, right about 8 or 9 cents of every dollar. That's your higher ed budget, that's your jails, and that's your human services. And everything else is about 12 cents of our tax dollar. But you need to understand when we're talking about taking money away from different things that we're voting on, it's taking money away from this pie. So you're really impacting the school funding, your higher ed funding, and your Medicaid funding. And notice there's no transportation up there. Primary source of funding for our roads is actually the gas fee. It's 22 cents per gallon. So what gas is $3.30 out there. 22 cents of that $3.30 is the per gallon gas tax. During good years, we sometimes give some of our general fund to roads, but mostly not. It's one of the reasons why we kind of underfund our roads in Colorado.
Chris, which is included under human services?
The human services, most people think human services, they think like food stamps or like TANF, direct like welfare transfers. Those are all federal. What human services does, it's like it pays for a county human services department to administer like food stamps and TANF, but all those dollars are federal. If you actually look at what human services does, it's like Meals on Wheels for elderly populations. It's like alcohol substance treatment for teens, and it's a lot of like abused kids programs, stuff like that. What are you doing through our county budgets? Yeah.
Chris, it looks like we're spending quite a bit on K-12 education. How do we compare nationally?
Quick question. So most people know we're underfunding our schools. We rank really poorly, at least starting teacher salary, we're like dead last. Per pupil funding, we're like in the 40s. So the lowest kind of among 50 states. This is a whole deeper lecture about how we fund schools locally versus how we fund things state. But we rank pretty poorly on per pupil funding in schools. We actually rank really poorly in higher ed funding too. 48th last rankings we had.
Wow.
So only 2 states spend less per full-time student than Colorado. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Medicaid budget has been growing. The other story is we kind of just have a smaller pie. If you actually rank our general fund pie among 50 states, you make the general fund the numerator and make our state GDP the denominator, and you can rank all 50 states. We're like 45th. So we're a pretty small state budget state compared to how really wealthy we are. In addition to that, we have TABOR, or the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. This is a constitutional amendment we passed in 1992. I've boiled TABOR down into 4 major provisions. The first is you can't raise taxes without a vote of the people. So going back to that gas tax, to raise the per gallon gas tax, you have to pass a statewide vote to do it. Even to adjust it for inflation, you need a statewide vote. One of the reasons why it hasn't been raised since 91. But basically, you can't raise new taxes on marijuana, you can't raise property tax, you can't raise income tax. No rate can go up without a vote of the people. So it makes it harder, unlike other states where your elected officials can vote, raise and lower taxes. Our elected officials can only lower taxes. Got to go to a vote to raise them. TABOR also outlaws certain types of taxes. It says we can't have a graduated income tax like most states. It says we can't have a real estate transfer tax. It says we can't have local income taxes. So like Aspen can't just tax income themselves. TABOR outlaws that in our Constitution. TABOR sets election provisions, tells you when we vote on taxes, what we can vote on in even and odd years because of TABOR. And then finally, this is the one that the provision of TABOR that's really in the news. TABOR caps how big government can grow each year. So TABOR says there's this cap. The cap grows by inflation plus population growth. So if prices go up 2%, population goes up 2%, that cap grows by 4%. I realize I need to change that inflation now. It's like population goes up 2%, inflation goes by 8%. Now, that cap can then grow by 10%. Or here's the kind of wonky chart where this snot-colored bar is that cap I'm showing with my snot-colored arm here. That grows by inflation plus population. And all the bars here represent taxes and fees that are subject to that revenue limit. And you can see if we collect more taxes and fees than that referendum seat cap allows, then all the revenue above the ref seat cap gets returned to taxpayers in the form of TABOR rebates. And so you can see the history of TABOR rebates. We're well above the TABOR cap this current year, 3.7 billion above. This is huge compared to the history of the rebates we've given. Projected to be 3.6 billion above, several billion above the next several years. To give you an idea of the history, this is well bigger than the largest TABOR rebates we've ever had. Previous largest TABOR rebate was in 2000, when we gave back 941 million. So we're talking 4 times as large as we've ever given back. 3.7 we returned this year. And so TABOR doesn't actually tell us how we have to return money to taxpayers. It just says the state can't keep it. Can't keep it and pay for schools, can't pay for roads, can't save it. It's got to return it to taxpayers. In the past, there's been like 24 different ways we return money. Lately, legislators have boiled them down into 3 different methods. And I say 3-ish, because this ties into the $750 checks that the Polis administration sent out in August. But the 3 current mechanisms to return money on the books are the senior homestead exemption. This is a property tax break for seniors who have lived in their home for 10 years and they're 65 and older. Basically exempt $100,000 worth of their home's value that's not subject to taxes. Second rebate mechanism is the temporary reduction in the income tax. So we just lowered the income tax rate a little bit to return money the following year. And then the 6-tier sales tax mechanism basically cleans up all the remaining money that has to be returned to taxpayers. It divides everyone into 6 tiers depending on where their income falls. And then they get a portion of that rebate of that tier. We're looking at what happened this year. We had to return 3.7 billion. So 160 million paid for the homestead exemption. 151-ish went out in a temporary reduction in the income tax. And then the Polis administration said, let's help out our election campaign, well, maybe, and then let's give out direct checks to voters. People are fighting inflation. He used all this TABOR rebate money that he had to have returned, would have to return in April, but just fast forwarded it and returned it in August. And so everyone got a flat $750 check. You got twice that if you filed jointly. Good question?
Why are we projected 4 times higher than we have previously?
So a lot of it had to do with the giant federal stimulus. There's 3 rounds of federal stimulus. I'm going to give you an idea. Federally, we injected $5.5 trillion in federal stimulus between unemployment insurance, between those direct checks, between all those other payments. The U.S. economy is only 20 trillion. I mean, so there's a ton of federal stimulus injected in the last 2 years. I think a lot of people since COVID, people that lost their jobs were the ones that weren't earning as much income anyway. People who kept on working from home were the upper income folks that typically paid a lot of the income tax. And then the third big factor that was driving Ledge Council's model is stock market sucked this year. Everyone sold. So there's a lot more capital gains money in this year's fiscal year spending than they anticipated. That was one of the drivers in the last several years. Good question. So we basically returned $2.7 billion by sending out direct checks in August. And then still we had $815 million that had to run through the 6-tier sales tax to clean up the remaining money that had to go back to taxpayers. I bet you'll see projected to have to return again $3 billion next year. It's been so popular. I doubt the administration will go back on doing it. I bet they'll do it again. I bet you'll look to see everyone get a similar same amount check mailed to them. So if you all didn't file taxes this year, you should like work a day, file taxes, and you'll probably get like $800 from the state. It's my tax advice. I'm not a legal tax attorney, but that's my own tax advice I'm giving. Here's some of the work I did at Colorado Fiscal Institute to just show the distributional impact of that move. So if you would have sent $2.7 billion back through the 6-tier mechanism, again, here's the tiers. So if you make less than 44, you fall into the first tier. If you ran that money through that way, they would have got 535. Instead, they got a check for 750. Top, would have got about 1,700. Instead of they got a check for 750. So it did redistribute about 300 million, probably from you're talking top 4% to lower income earners. So it's a more progressive way to return TABOR rebate money. Okay, but anything that we change. If we change anything in the bottom of the ballot, it's going to change how much money is in this bar, and it will change how much money will then be returned to taxpayers in the form of TABOR rebates. But if you're selfishly looking at the ballot, putting $300 million toward homelessness could change how much money you get in your Polis check next year. And so that sets up for the 11 things that are on the bottom of the ballot. The first one is a proposition. Remember, it changes the law. Went through the citizens initiative process because it's a number. This is going to ask voters to cut permanently our 4.55% flat income tax rate to 4.4. So that's going to suck out about $400 million out of the TABOR bar. So that means $400 million won't be returned through that 6-tier sales tax rebate. Well, on net, that actually gives less money to those in the bottom 3 tiers. Because, like, say, for instance, someone makes $50,000, they might get $20 from the income tax cut, but they're going to lose out on $70 that would have came back through them through the 6-tier rebate. So on net, this actually kind of raises taxes on the bottom 91, anyone making less than 91,000. And then on net, it's a big boom for people who have all the taxable income. It broadly based cuts the rate. So those who have a lot of taxable income see a big benefit. We have a 4.55% flat income tax rate. I pay this 4.55%. Russell Wilson pays the same 4.55, even though we say the same amount of touchdowns. Russell Wilson joke. Or look at it another way. The 1% owns 23% of taxable income. So let's take 23% of the benefit of its income tax rate cut. Whereas the bottom 2/3 of filers in the state only have 18.5% of the taxable income. Basically, broadly based cutting income tax gives much more to the 1% as it does to the bottom 2/3 of tax filers in the state. definitely a progressive way of returning 400 million.
Who's sponsoring proposition 114?
I think it's who's the blanking. The Independence Institute, conservative, kind of more anti-tax, anti-government think tank. Went through the citizenship process. Any questions? An income tax cut. Related to income tax cut is a transparency issue. And so right now, there's no process to show voters or tax filers what they're voting on, how the change in tax rates have a distributional impact. Prop GG would require people who are collecting signatures for a tax cut to put this chart on the petition, so they know how much people in different income categories would gain or lose from a tax cut or tax change. This chart would also have to go on the ballot. So when we're considering a tax cut, we'd have to show, how little someone making minimum wage gets compared to billionaire or millionaire. That's on the ballot. We get to consider that on the bottom of the ballot this year. That's Prop GG. We have a healthy schools lunch program on the ballot this year, Prop FF. So some background, with the COVID stimulus, we gave free lunch to all students for 2 years, and it was federally funded. So you didn't have to qualify by poverty, you didn't have to be free and reduced lunch. Any student in our K-12 system could get free lunch, paid for by the feds. Well, those 2 years ended, the funding source dries up, we don't have that money from the feds anymore. So this would allow us to continue that program and give everyone free lunch in our schools, and it would be funded by capping deductions on those making more than $300,000. So remember I started with AGI and taxable income. I said all that stuff in the middle where you whittle down your AGI into lower taxable. Well, someone who makes about $300,000 on average has about $35,000 in those exemptions, deductions, that stuff in the middle. So they can whittle down $300,000 into, $260. And then their income tax rates are applied. This would cap the amount of deductions they're allowed to take to about like $16,000. So it basically adds more taxable income to those filers who make more than $300,000. And so by doing that, it generates about an extra $100 million. So there's the pay for. I helped design this program, actually. It came to us and wanted someone to run the economics and the fiscal impacts to generate $100 million. It basically gave us parameters. Generate $100 million, only tax like the top 7%. So we helped design the pay for this one. That basically gives free lunch by raising $100 million on those making more than $300,000, by capping those deductions.
What's the current cap on those deductions?
Yeah, so there was no cap until several years ago. There was a bill that capped deductions on those making more than $500,000. And it was capped at like something around 35,000, I think. So we've already actually kind of milked a bit of the revenue from capping deductions on millionaires. This kind of slides it down to those making more than 300. Questions? Yeah.
So was that cap a few years ago? Was that also voted on, or does that somehow like bypass TABOR?
That's a great question. So it sounds like a tax increase. No, it wasn't a tax rate increase. It's just basically taking back special tax treatment. So that's actually not under TABOR. That's not raising taxes. It's basically if I was giving you a special tax treatment, like a credit, legislators can take away a credit because it's not really raising taxes. It's basically taking back giveaway. Maybe that's what I don't know how to say that, but yeah. That was by a bill.
Okay.
Our legislators under the Gold Dome voted on, passed a bill through the process, got signed by the governor to do that. Good question. That's the healthy freeze lunch. And there's also some provisions that like allows school districts to buy local farm fresh food. It also allows them to use some of the money to pay their cafeteria workers more. It's a little bit of a boost to the low wage kind of cafeteria workers under that one. This Amendment E, again, changes the Constitution. This is a very small one, and it impacts the homestead exemption, that property tax break for seniors. So just the mechanics of that. If a senior has 400, they get to subtract 100 of value before they run times the assessment rate times their local mills. That's how the homestead exemption, so basically exempts $100,000 of value. We voted on that in 2000, put it in our constitution. Several years later, we also said disabled veterans could qualify for that, no matter how old they are. But if your disabled veteran passes away, the spouse then loses that property tax break. And so Amendment E would extend the homestead exemption to Gold Star spouses. So if they lose their partner who's a military veteran and who passes away, they still get the property tax break. But imagine this passes pretty highly, 70% of the vote, I bet, pretty high. It impacts like 490 households in the state. And it's like $500,000, so it's like a rounding error on $18 billion worth of state budget. So I think that's very controversial. Prop 121, this is the affordable housing one. And this would create a separate pot of money. It would basically divert some of our income tax. Instead of that income tax flowing into the general fund, that again pays for schools, Medicaid, roads, higher education, it would take 1%, 1/10 of 1% of taxable income, basically suck out $300 million and put it in a separate funding pot. And that $300 million would then be used for affordable housing projects, homelessness programs, down payments for affordable housing, first-time home buyers. It's a real complicated formula. Like 60% goes to certain department, 40% goes to the Department of Local Affairs that does affordable housing. Another 60% goes to the Affordable Housing Financing Fund. It's a complicated breakdown, but it's spelled out in the bill. There's basically guardrails on what that money can be used for, but basically all for affordable housing to address the homelessness issue, affordable housing issue. But again, it takes $300 million out of our TABOR rebates. So if you're thinking what that means per tax filer, it's about $42, I figured. I ran the numbers. You're sacrificing $42 worth of TABOR rebate in your check next year to dedicate $300 million in the statewide budget to do affordable housing. That's Prop 123. Again, it's a proposition, so legislators could change it in the future a lot easier than if it was an amendment. Okay. So those are what I call the fiscal issues, the ones I know more about. And there are a handful of ones that are not like tax related, they're magic mushroom and alcohol related. And so we have the Prop 124, 125, 126. It's a pretty well-financed campaign by the big liquor lobby. 124, you can probably see these commercials lately. Prop 124 would basically increase the amount of locations the big liquor stores can have. Like Argonaut Liquor, big chain stores can only have 3 locations in the state. If 124 passes, it expands that to like 8 and then like 13, and then in the future, it goes even higher. So basically, allows the big chain liquor stores to have more locations. The big out-of-state chain liquor stores are huge fans of these 3. Small mom and pop liquor stores are not a fan of any of these 3. So it expands the number of liquor stores the big locations can have. 125, to give you some background, several years ago, we expanded gas stations and grocery stores' ability to sell alcohol, to sell beer, full-strength beer. So now you can buy full-strength beer at Safeway or your gas station, but you can't buy wine at Safeway right now. This would allow all those grocery stores and convenience stores to also sell wine. Again, that would hurt the business of the small mom and pop liquor store, benefit big liquor stores, benefit grocery stores. And then there's third-party delivery. So when the pandemic hit and everyone was ordering Grubhub and DoorDash and getting Little India delivered for their chicken tiki marsala, or at least I was. Little India could deliver alcohol, but they had to be an employee of Little India. They couldn't have a Grubhub who doesn't work for Little India deliver me alcohol. If this passes, this would allow the Grubhub driver or the DoorDash driver to also deliver alcohol with your chicken tiki marsala. And there's a whole system set up that they have to verify your license and verify your age. This is the expandability of third-party delivery to also bring alcohol with your Grubhub order, basically. And then we got the magic mushrooms one, Prop 122. This doesn't legalize psilocybin or those magic mushrooms. It decriminalizes it. and also sets up a regulatory system where they can establish some therapeutic centers for doctors to administer microdoses of those certain psychedelic substances. I know very little about this one. This is I call this presentation the fiscal policies behind the ballot and me faking my way through magic mushrooms. So don't ask me magic mushroom questions. Look at the blue book. Julie has a blue book. For voters get sent the blue book, and the blue book explains all the complicated pros and cons, fiscal issues of what we get to vote on in the state. Yeah.
I know you don't want to talk about that. What's the difference between decriminalizing and legalizing?
I don't know very well. We legalize recreational cannabis, so state dispensaries can legally sell it. I don't think you can sell it. I think doctors can administer. It doesn't say in the bill how they have to do it. That the state will have to figure out a regulatory system to do these grants or whatever application process to get a therapeutic psilocybin administration thing or whatever, but I'm not sure. Two more. Amendment F. Amendment F, this is like, it gives the ability for nonprofits to have bingo, basically. That's what I call this one. Right now, if you're a nonprofit, you got to wait 5 years before you can do it, like a small games of chance or like a bingo for money or a 50-50 fundraiser. This would allow nonprofits to do it after 3 years and also give the ability to actually pay the person doing the bingo pulling the numbers. It expands charitable gaming operations for nonprofits. And then Amendment D. So in our last census, Colorado's been growing. One of our judicial districts grew past the million-person threshold. And so basically our judicial district got too big. They have to add a new judicial district. So the 18th district got too big. They have to add a new district called the 23rd. But state law is ambiguous on how they distribute those judges. There's no law. It's unclear if the judges in the 18th have to live in the new 23rd district or how that works. If they should have a whole new election about recall those judges. But basically, the law is unclear. A yes vote basically gives Governor Polis the ability to say which one of those judges in the 18th goes to the 23rd. So it kind of clears up ambiguity in the law as we add this new district because Colorado has grown. Okay. That is the my prepared slides. Any questions? Yeah.
Can you go back to, can you just explain again how like a decrease in the flat income rate, I think you said like more or less kind of increased taxes for lower income earners?
Yeah, it's complicated. So there's two things involved. So like say you make $30,000. Once you take your exemptions, deductions, gambling losses, whatever, deduct your student loans, you might only have $8,000 worth of taxable income. So $8,000, difference between 4.55 and 4.4 on $8,000 is a very small amount of money saving you. But remember, TABOR collects all taxes and fees as part of that bar. So if we pass the income tax rate, this bar drops by 400 million, essentially taking 400 million out of the money that has to be returned to you. If that $400 million was still there, it would go through the 6-tier sales tax rebate mechanism. And so that would give you, you get more money in that 6-tier sales tax rebate, 400 million through that mechanism, than returning 400 million through an income tax cut. So on net, it might, I ran the numbers for someone making 50,000. On net, they lose like 50 some dollars. Because the 6-tier sales tax will give them like 75 back. That slight cut in the income tax rate to your modest taxable income isn't much for you. So on net.
So Chris, then here you the 6-tier sales tax. So if they go with the Polis checks, how they could call it, it would actually be even more than, right, if we were to use that estimate for what they might get back?
Yes, because the flat checks are actually more progressive. So on net, this would be even worse. If the rebate mechanism, instead of returning 400 million to the income tax cut, you would run it through. I mean, there's maybe 3.5 million income tax filers. So what's 400 million divided by 3.5? 400 divided by 3.5 is how much money it would cost you. Other thoughts or questions? The election is Tuesday. We've had our ballots for several weeks. So if you haven't filled out your ballot.
How quickly do propositions and amendments take action? Like say this Proposition 121, if it were to be passed, would it be starting 2023?
I think Taylor bill, I think it actually would start 2022 tax year.
Okay.
But I mean, you can word your bills whatever you want. Like for instance, when we passed Amendment 64 to legalize recreational cannabis, we passed it in the 2012 election, but it didn't legalize it until 2014. Like you'd have to look at the specific bills. They'll be dictated in the language of the bill, and it will explain it in the blue book.
So then if Proposition 121 passed and Proposition FF also passed, would that be taken out of the table as well?
Yes.
So we can make 330 or more.
Yeah, so it's your question on net. If these couple of things that take out revenue, they'll suck. So if the healthy free lunch passes, it'll suck out about 300 million. And if the income tax cut passes, it takes about 400 million. So that would reduce our TABOR rebates by about 700 million. Yes.
Sorry.
I was just curious, do you guys have any predictions or trends for further down the line with this TABOR rebate? And do you like predict that eventually it's going to get back to around being sort of zero, or is that even something that the government wants to be? Because it definitely like promotes the campaign and or the politicians in place with they're giving back money.
Well, definitely, yeah, it's nice to run on, nice to sign a check, put your polis on it.
Yeah.
And send an actual check to people. It depends who you ask. Like the education community that wants to get more money for schools. I mean, if you really look at the history of education funding, we made drastic cuts when we hit the recession back in 2010. We cut like $1 billion from our schools, and we've never really paid. It's like $1 billion shortfall. It's been this year. It's like 350 million. We're basically underfunding our schools since the last recession. And so a lot of pro-education advocates will say, this is insane that we suck at per pupil funding. We're 50th in starting teacher salary, and we're giving $3.7 billion. We're giving 21%, like that's 21% of the general fund. Give you an idea of the relative size of that giant TABOR rebate. So there, and you see this like the affordable housing advocates are trying to get stuff on the ballot to absorb some of that TABOR rebate and establish a separate funding mechanism for homeless programs. But it's your question of like it's so hard to predict. Like if you actually look at the data on how well legislative council projections are, I mean, they legally will only go out 3 years. And if you actually look at how close they are, like the margin of error even 1 year out is like 20%. It gets even worse 3 years out. Give you some history. Like in 2000, when we were given 940 million, there was a letter signed by like 20 economists that said, we will have TABOR rebates forever. And then Twin Towers came down, and then saving, they had a Enron and whatever triggered a 2001 recession, and look at a giant drop in revenue. So I won't publicly say anything about what I think in 3 years.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is this does act as a sort of a cushion, because our legislators can only really budget to the ref C cap. So they know exactly how much money they'll have in the state budget. It doesn't matter what the economy does next year or next month, because they have a 20% cushion. So even if the economy, we have a zombie recession or something, the 20% cushion is this huge amount of money that they still probably won't hit the ref C cap. So it's actually pretty, as a budgeter, it's pretty easy because you know exactly how much money you have. You don't need to worry about the state of the economy, collections of severance tax, income tax, sales tax, because of that kind of cushion.
So is it right to say that Prop 121 is for high income people and Prop FF is for lower income?
Well, yeah, Prop FF raises 100 million on top, 5% or so, and Prop 121 cuts the income tax rate, which gives a quarter of the benefit to those making more than $500,000. So yeah, I think it's definitely, but I mean, every student would benefit from free lunch. So that you're getting it back in students, whether you're a rich student or a poor student.
Do you know how that's going? At the,
CU released their poll this week, actually. I didn't look at it yet, but the data's out there. If you just actually Google CU's state of political something, it's out there.
What is the likelihood that an average voter without your presentation fully understands what
Yeah.
you say?
That's why I laugh, you know, you have to understand, that's why I led with that AGI, taxable income, very complicated stuff, and you can't boil that down into a 20-second commercial during Jeopardy or the World Series. So I guess it speaks to the fact that, like, people say it's like really easy to get on the ballot and do the citizen initiative process, but it takes several $1 million to get that many signatures. Then you also need several $1 million worth of advertising to even get something even close. And in addition, most people that don't understand things, they automatically vote no.
Right.
So you kind of have the status quo bias against ever passing anything, because the default is I don't understand this. No.
Right.
So it does create a lot more headwinds to say try to pass complicated tax policy through the ballot.
Probably with some biases to that no bias tax cuts. I would guess are probably a little bit more popular.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've passed 2 statewide tax increases, and they were on marijuana and cigarettes since TABOR. Basically, we've done sin taxes, but we've never really raised too many actual tax increases. Now, a lot of tax increases passed locally, so your local sheriff district, your local school district will raise property taxes. Those are successful. Statewide tax increases are very, very poor record.
Chris, we have a lot of young voters and young economists or folks kind of thinking about how they want to pursue economics. As someone in doing policy tax kind of work, what would you encourage them to look at in terms of understanding Colorado tax policy, kind of, you know, as a voter and just kind of also an economist, things to look at?
If you want to be in the know, so one thing I would do is I would always listen to the revenue estimates. So our economists called legislative counsel, they're the ones that have to do all this complicated stuff, these fiscal notes for every bill, and they write the blue book. Every quarter, so every 3 months, they go in front of the governor and the JBC, the budget committee, and they say what's going on in the economy. They say what's going on with like oil and gas taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, what's going on, basically how much money the legislature will have next year to write next year's budget. And they come out in June, September, and December. So if you wanted to kind of get your ear to the ground of like fiscal policy, you would not do bad. Just listen to that hour. Listen to the revenue estimates from legislative counsel. They have some really good fiscal, just some wonky memos they put out. Our company, Colorado Fiscal Institute, also, we published a purple book. I think even actually Dr. DeVuz uses it as in his public policy class. Yeah, anything online?
No, I offered. If anybody online has a question, by all means, we can take those too.
I just remember seeing and hearing about, before I was even a voter, just similar propositions regarding alcohol and stuff like that in years past. Is there like a limit to the amount of time certain propositions can end up on the ballot, or if companies keep funding them and pushing them if they can keep ending up? Because I know that that's like the
liquor lobby keep putting stuff on, or the one a couple of years ago, there was a cigarette tax increase that did not pass. If you went to Secretary of State's office and looked at the funding, the anti-funding on that one, it all came out of Richmond, Virginia. It was in Richmond, Virginia. Philip Morris, I mean, the biggest cigarette maker. That's discussing how much out-of-state money buys up ads on the Broncos game here. They will always have that. There's a bunch of different complicated rules on, there's certain deadlines you need to meet to get this file to the Secretary of State's office, and you got to go through a process to make sure the ballot is not, there's a word sloganeering. You can have sloganeering in the title. And there's a bunch of like policies that the legal team has to vet before it can get on the ballot. And there's a whole calendar of things to meet to get on. Like that comes like fast and furious in like April-ish. You're trying to get on the ballot for November. There's nothing stopping anyone with deep pockets to put on. If you want to run a thing that says give a tax cut to economist whose last name is Stiffler, if I had $5 million, I could probably try to get that on the bottom of the ballot.
I know that this is entirely different talk, but who supported TABOR at the beginning?
TABOR was passed in '92. Really interesting electorate back then. Ross Perot was on the bottom of the ballot. On the bottom, there was very independent vote on the '92 election. Very interesting electorate because there was a lot of let's not be California sentiment. You had a very tail end of Reaganism kind of anti-tax philosophy. It's some Doug Bruce from California getting it on the bottom of the ballot, third time. There's a couple of LGBTQ related stuff on the bottom of the ballot that year that drove an interesting electorate. But it polls really well. TABOR sounds really good. I mean, no one knows anything about TABOR. If you teach them about TABOR for a minute, they'll like it more. And then you got to listen to an hour lecture about how it's killed our schools and killed our roads and destroyed our higher ed funding before they might say, it's maybe not quite so great. There's a lot of people that love TABOR.
I mean, it seems that it requires education. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. That's true. And that's one of the reasons why the blue book is.
Right. Who is going to read it?
Yeah. It's like the
All right. Any last call for questions from online?
Probably there's one from access to central fund. It looks like all of the troubles in this, as you're saying, this helps people with depression. But when this says this
decriminalize. Say again.
so they decriminalize it for everybody. They're not, they want them to indicate that it helps people with depression. This decriminalizes it for everybody.
As I understand it, yeah.
They want to.
Yes. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, I'm not registered to vote in Colorado, but what were the proposition about the raising taxes for the funding of the
Lunches?
yes, yeah.
I don't know the bullet in my mind.
It's around 64% for.
Really?
According to the CU poll.
You look at CU,
Yeah.
That's pretty high.
Yeah, unfortunately, they only did polling for 3 propositions, so
That's how I couldn't find the other ones. Okay.
Yeah.
I did FF and GG.
FFGG and 125.
Oh, okay.
And so register to vote in Colorado.
So you did,
I'm
yes.
registered to vote in Colorado.
Thanks for coming and thanks for the great questions.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.